Welcome to Preaching Innovation Lab, a project of the Kerygma Initiative here at Palmer Theological Seminary. This is a monthly series of short interviews featuring authors of recent books on preaching, books we believe can inspire preachers to think afresh about the theory and the practice of preaching. I'm David Stark, director of the Kerygma Initiative and instructor of homiletics at Palmer. Today, we're excited to meet with Dr. Jerusha Matsen Neal. Dr. Neal is Associate Professor of Homiletics at Duke University Divinity School. She is the author of The Overshadowed Preacher, Mary, the Spirit, and the Labor of Proclamation. A former actress and playwright, Dr. Neal has also authored a collection of dramatic monologues titled Blessed, Monologues for Mary. Jerusha is an ordained American Baptist minister with broad ecumenical experience, notably having served as Dean of Studies at Davuilevu Theological College as a global ministries missionary to the Fiji Islands through the United Methodist Church. We are so thrilled that you are able to join us. Welcome, Dr. Neal.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here, Dr. Stark. I'm so grateful for the work that Palmer's doing for preachers.
We are so grateful to have you. Help me pronounce again, because I believe I mispronounced.
You did well. No, you landed it. Davuilevu.
Davuilevu.
Shell, and levu means large. So it is actually like a large conch shell. Davuilevu. You got it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, today we are discussing your book, Holy Ground, Climate Change, Preaching, and the Apocalypse of Place. You've written this fantastic book on preaching and climate justice that is groundbreaking, I believe, not only in its insights into the topic, but in its methodology. Most notably, your book reflects on your lived experience and engagement with the Fijian people. And I wonder if you might talk with us today a little bit about that. Maybe first, I might want to ask you, how does your work on climate justice preaching in and beyond Fiji correct, deepen, or expand the way preachers often think about the role of place in preaching?
So I was in Fiji at the invitation of the Fijian Methodist Church, invited my husband and I to come. We lived there for 3 years. We served alongside Fijian pastors. And one of the things I noticed after having been there long enough to sort of listen carefully to what I was hearing was that the questions that these pastors were asking about place were quite different from the questions about place that many folks in North America in mainline homiletic circles were asking. So homiletics talks about place a lot. We talk about it in relation to translation. How do you translate sort of into a different place than your own so you can have kind of universal relevance? We talk about it in relation to persuasion. How do you persuade in a particular place people who have a particular agenda? We talk about creating places, right? Like creating the world of the biblical text, right? In a new place. These Fijian pastors were asking questions that grew out of the fact that currently there are about 42 indigenous villages that are actually being relocated because of rising tides. They were losing their ancestral homes and places because of climate change. They were asking questions like, who is responsible for a place? They were asking questions like, how does one belong to a place? Is it because you have a deed, you paid some money? Is it because you have a military might and can take the land? How do you belong? And how do we decide who belongs? And most notably, they were asking questions about loss. What do you do when you lose this place that has been a vital part of your identity? And what struck me about those questions is, first of all, it moved the climate conversation into much deeper theological waters. All of a sudden, it wasn't a question of, oh, how do you, give a snazzy sermon about climate justice so that people will do what they're supposed to do and recycle. They were asking questions that were very aligned with the biblical text. Like, can the creation and covenant of a good God come undone? And of course, that question doesn't have an easy answer in Scripture. That question about loss of place is the tear-stained cry at the root of much of our biblical text. I'll say one final thing on this question, one insight. We'll talk about that more a little bit, I know, in a minute. But one of the insights that I think that expanded my definition of place are the ways that these communities understood place as a character in God's story, a covenant partner. Right out of the Noahic covenant, God creates a covenant with all flesh, every living thing. And in Fiji, pastors took this really seriously. And one of the ways they did that is to pay attention to how place preaches. They had this sense that when you preach as a pastor, you are not only preaching to your congregation, you are preaching in concert with the very ground you're standing on, sometimes in complement, sometimes in contradiction. And I'm still unpacking the significance of that for what it means to preach climate justice.
Yeah, no, was a really powerful insight from your book, and I appreciate you naming it here. And it seems to me that it's connected with some of your work on scripture as well.
Sure.
One of the things that struck me reading your book was that you talked about the need, or maybe the desire to move beyond the sort of typical Genesis and Romans engagement with scripture. And so I just wonder if you might say a little more to us
Sure.
about how does your work on climate justice preaching in and beyond Fiji affect the way preachers often think about scripture in preaching? How did it affect the way you thought about scripture in
That's right.
preaching?
So I've taught classes before on climate justice preaching, and so I've kind of surveyed sermons on this subject. And you're right, many are from Genesis 1 and from Romans 8, creation groaning, right? And they're great passages. I'm nothing against Romans or Genesis. But one of the things that I realized listening to these pastors is actually how much of our biblical text is relevant to these deep questions about place as a covenantal partner and what righteousness looks like, what faithfulness looks like in relation to that partner. I found myself spending lots of time in the exilic prophets. I do a deep dive in holy ground, believe it or not, into Ezekiel, who is not an easy conversation partner. But I think he's asking these questions. He's lost land. He's been displaced. He's wondering who God is, what his vocation means, what his people's vocation means in the face of devastation. And so I think there's so much more of the biblical text that is relevant. I do think that many times people who are settled in places, who haven't experienced displacement, don't always know what we're looking at in scripture. We'll read something, for example, in Ezekiel that feels very harsh, or it feels, it confuses, right, the rubrics that we bring of interpretation. And one of the things that I think became a deep conviction for me through this project is that one of the most important ways, I think, for preachers to deeply engage these biblical texts around place is to read them with displaced people, to actually read them alongside people who are asking not questions about universal relevance and power and control and, gentrification, right? But people that are really asking questions about what God is calling them to when the very land under their feet is turning strange.
Yeah, I really appreciate you naming that, because two things about that. One, I think Ezekiel is such a surprising and surprisingly helpful conversation partner. And then through your engagement with Ezekiel and with the Fijian people, you really develop in your book a powerful insight into the need for relationality. And you talk a lot in the last chapter about listening. And I wonder if you might say just a little bit more about how has your work and your research and reflection on climate justice preaching in and beyond Fiji corrected, deepened, expanded the way preachers often think about relationality in preaching?
So that section on listening in the last chapter of the book came out of a conversation with Dr. Marankambale, who teaches church history at the Pacifica Communities University in Suva. And he applies this idea of listening to sort of his method of how he looks at historical texts and historical conversations. And he says 4 things, and this grows out of Fijian practices of listening to one another. That to listen deeply means to listen to silences. In other words, listen to who's not at the table. Where are the gaps, right, in the conversation? It means listening with mutuality, which for him means not only being silent, but then risking speech yourself, taking turns, so to speak. Third, it means listening with respect. So not simply listening in order to deconstruct, but to listen very carefully to hear what is happening perhaps under your first assessment. And finally, to listen for response. So to listen with some skin in the game so that you don't just listen to sort of show your knowledge, but that it actually informs righteous, faithful behavior in the world. And I think that is not only a kind of relationality that impacts the way we treat other humans. It's a way that also impacts how we listen to non-human creation and to the biblical text, for that matter, right? Yeah. This place that is also other from where we stand. How do we listen carefully to these texts? And I just think that's so vital right now. One of the ways to read the climate crisis, and I am partial to this in the book, is how the climate crisis has been the result of not listening to creation, not listening to our neighbor, actually not listening to the biblical text, and instead listening to these dangerous nationalist projects that are really land grabs, that treat the places of others as objects, commodities for our gain. Yeah. Rather than covenantal partners. And I think that word is the word to land on, is that if Fijian preachers taught me anything, it was the fact that my definition of covenant was actually far too limited and far too thin. That covenantal relationality, which is really how righteousness is described throughout our text, requires something far more than we have understood.
Yeah, what a gift just to talk with you for a few minutes. Thank you so much, Jerusha, for offering your time and your wisdom. Viewers, if like me, you wish that we had more time today with Dr. Neal, let me encourage you to pick up a copy of her book, Holy Ground, Climate Change Preaching and the Apocalypse of Place. Thank you again, Dr. Neal.
Thank you, David.
And thank you all for joining us for this episode of Preaching Innovation Lab. We hope today's conversation sparked new ideas and fresh energy for your preaching ministry. Until next time, grace and peace.